Member for Saanich North and Islands.
Aitsquachel, Aitsquasiam, good day. Thank you, Mr. Speaker. It's good to see you all. Last week, we commemorated the first annual National Day for Truth and Reconciliation, Day of Reflection and Healing. And today, and every day, I'm thinking of my relatives and all the survivors of Indian residential and day schools. Before reconciliation must come truth. Here are some truths. 6 years ago, the Truth and Reconciliation published 94 calls to action for all governments in Canada, the federal, provincial, and territorial governments, to act on the horrific information that was gathered through an intense truth-telling exercise that finally forced Crown governments and politicians to listen to what Indigenous people had been telling for decades about the tragic, disgusting history of Indian residential and day schools. It's not just history, though. It's how Crown governments relate to Indigenous people today as well. For 6 years, Action 80 languished, collecting dust on a shelf in federal, provincial, and territorial offices. The action calling on those governments to create a, quote, statutory holiday, a national day for truth and reconciliation to honor survivors, their families and communities, and to ensure that public commemoration of the history and legacy of residential schools remains a vital component of the reconciliation process, end quote. On May 27, 2021, we learned more about the truth of Indian residential and day schools when Kukpi Roseanne Casimir, chief of the Tecumlip's de Secwepemc, shared that ground-penetrating radar had identified 215 remains of children that were sent to and never returned home from the Kamloops Indian Residential School. After an overwhelming response from British Columbians and Canadians, after our true history was exposed once again for the whole world to see, it took our federal government only 6 days, what languished on the books for 6 years. They finally created that statutory holiday for February the 30th each year. September the 30th for each year. Even then, our provincial and territorial governments were ill-prepared to respond. So, on the first annual federal statutory holiday to commemorate the survivors and their families of Indian residential and day schools, we saw across the country an uncoordinated patchwork reaction that frankly tells a story unto itself. If it were just Action 80, that would be one thing, but unfortunately it is not. The Truth and Reconciliation Commission calls to action names provincial governments 22 times, demanding our leadership take this work seriously. Commissioners call on our government to reduce the number of children in care, not just by changing how we account for children in care, but rather actually changing our systems. The Commission calls on the provincial governments to reform education, healthcare, and justice systems. Much of this might be done in British Columbia, but how much have we accomplished? What mechanism is holding government accountable to ensure that these reforms actually happen? The TRC asked that the provincial governments repudiate the doctrine of discovery and terra nullius and to, quote, reform those laws, government policies, and litigation strategies that continue to rely on such concepts, end quote. Has that been done yet? I don't think so. So what do we have? The provincial government arguing some Indigenous people don't exist, and as a result, Indigenous people wasting precious resources establishing their basic existence. So this is not just our past. This is what is happening in our province today, and in provinces across the country, and in our federal government. Since the TRC's calls to action were published, the final report of the National Inquiry into the Missing and Murdered Indigenous Women and Girls was published, along with 231 calls to justice. The inquiry was charged with getting to the root causes of the violence experienced by Indigenous girls, women, girls, and 2S LGBTQIA people. The report stated clearly, quote, the violence the National Inquiry heard about amounts to a race-based genocide of Indigenous peoples, including First Nations, Inuit, and Métis, which especially targets women, girls, and 2S LGBTQIA people. This genocide has been empowered by colonial structures, evidenced notably by the Indian Act, the 60s scoop, residential schools, and breaches of human Indigenous rights leading directly to the current increased rates of violence, death, and suicide in Indigenous populations, end quote. Today is the National Day of Action for missing and murdered Indigenous women, girls, and two-spirited people. The Union of BC Indian Chiefs wrote in their media advisory announcing a vigil this evening at Vancouver City Hall, saying the following, quote, "Although the vigil today reminds us of the ongoing tragedies we must mourn, it also empowers us to proudly assert our identities, cultures, and traditions as we continue the fight for justice. We call upon Canada and British Columbia to take immediate, meaningful action to implement the Missing and Murdered Indigenous Women and Girls calls for justice that are focused on replacing a justice model that perpetuates trauma with one that is aligned with Indigenous values, cultures, and traditions," end quote. Indigenous leaders were deeply critical of the National Action Plan released earlier this summer, and the UBCIC wrote in their response on June 3rd, quote, "This plan does not answer how to keep Indigenous women and girls and 2SLGBTQIA+ people safe, with no specific information about how, when, and by whom concrete actions will be taken. Nowhere in this document do governments acknowledge and accept responsibility for laws, policies, and practices that contribute to and perpetuate the ongoing genocide of Indigenous peoples, and specifically of Indigenous women, girls, and 2SLGBTQIA+ people," end quote. British Columbia stepped up with $5.5 million worth of funding, a frustratingly small investment, especially when taken into consideration with the context of a provincial budget that is worth tens of billions of dollars. Throughout the last Parliament, I worked closely with the former Minister of Indigenous Relations and Reconciliation, Scott Fraser, on these issues. We all celebrated together completing Action 43 of the TRC calls to action, quote, "to fully adopt and implement the United Nations Declaration on the Rights of Indigenous Peoples as a framework for reconciliation," end quote. British Columbia was the first province to do so. And this is an important step that this colonial institution takes towards reconciliation. This past summer, government released a draft action plan for the implementation of the commitments within that Declaration Act. These actions commit all cabinet ministers in our government to aligning their ministerial operations, the new laws they are creating, the old laws already on the books, the regulations, the policy, with the spirit of that declaration. The Declaration Act was passed in November 2019. We are nearing the 2-year anniversary of this act, and where do we stand today? Unfortunately, we are not as far down that road as I believed we had all hoped we would be on that celebratory autumn day when the Indigenous leaders of our province spoke right there at that clerk's table. Following the election last year, the Premier mandated the Minister of Indigenous Relations and Reconciliation to, quote, "create a dedicated secretariat by the end of 2021 to coordinate government's reconciliation efforts and to ensure new legislation and policies are consistent with the Declaration on the Rights of Indigenous Peoples Act," end quote. We are getting close to the end of 2021, and I know that Indigenous leaders in British Columbia are eagerly anticipating the news of the creation of this secretariat as they continue to express the frustration of working with a government that has yet to coordinate these efforts. As we heard from so many Indigenous leaders on September 30th, that truth must come before reconciliation. So we start with truth, and the next steps we take together will not be easy. As Honourable Murray Sinclair, the former chair of the Truth and Reconciliation Commission, said, he recognized that getting to the truth was going to be hard, but getting to reconciliation was going to be even more difficult. None of this criticism is going to be easy for any of us in this place or government officials to hear, but I can assure you that it is a fraction of the challenge that life has been for Indigenous people, for my family, for my ancestors, and indeed all survivors of Indian residential and day schools. Let's not forget the words of Honourable Murray Sinclair, quote, "We may not achieve reconciliation within my lifetime or within the lifetime of my children, But we will be able to achieve it if we all commit to working towards it properly. Part of that commitment is that this year, on September the 30th, we will stand together and we will say never again. What we did in this country was wrong, and we will never allow it to happen again, end quote. Now, I'm thankful that this work started last week, and I look forward to contributing to it in years to come. Aiskutsiam.